Hi, everybody, and welcome to the May 2022 edition of Streets for All Happy Hour. I need a haircut. So excited to have a special guest, Dr. Daniel Lee, who's the mayor of Culver City and a candidate right now for higher office with us. Before we get to our conversation with Mayor Lee, we're going to go over an update on the state measures we're backing, give you an update on our ballot measure, Healthy Streets LA, talk about what happened in Griffith Park and what we're trying to do to change the status quo, announce some additional endorsements, go over a few wins of the month, and we'll get to our special guest. Our icebreaker, very relevant for our guest, is everyone's going to say what is their most and least favorite part about Move Culver City. And Mayor, if you want to answer that too, you are welcome to when we start a conversation. I'm going to turn over to Bubba to answer that question and give us an update on state measures. Bubba.
Thanks, Michael. I don't have a least favorite part of Move Culver City. It's amazing. There's only room for improvement. Best part about Move Culver City is probably just the reduction in noise outside of my apartment because I live on it. And my least, or the thing that could be improved, I'm going to say those signals. Yeah, like when people walk, you should be able to bike. But for some reason, those things are separate, like walking goes first, then biking goes first, that goes next, or what have you. So I think the signal timing could be better, but it's amazing and transformative. Can we stand? State measures. This is the part of the presentation where I freak out about how many incredible bills are working their way through the state legislature, and I give you a quick update on that. Obviously, we've talked about it, but each bill has to go through both houses, through the policy committees, the fiscal committees, and then to the floor of that house for a vote before it goes to the next house and then to the governor's desk for a signature. And so if you go to the next slide, you can go through all of our endorsed bills so far on streetsforall.org/state. We made some really pretty art for each one that you can browse through and see what's on the docket, because it really is shaping up to be potentially a historic year for transportation justice in California. And in the next slide, we also created a mobility report card. This was the hard work of some of our awesome volunteers. This I'm really excited about. This is the first time we're debuting it. We've talked about it on this a little bit, but it's finally live at streetsforall.org/report-card. I'm actually going to link to it in the chat because it's so cool. And you can look up your legislators and see how they did last year, because the whole report card is just last year for now, because we only started endorsing bills last year. So this is all from the 2021 legislative session. You can look up your senator and assembly member and see how whether they're extraordinary, that's the top grade, perfect is the second to the top, and then all the way down A through F. And we plan to use this to hold our legislators' feet to the fire and reward those allies who are doing great work. And there's really nothing else like it that we've found so far. So it's kind of cool that we made one. If you go to the next slide, we have some great news. None of the bills we have endorsed so far are dead yet, which is great. They're still working their way through the first policy committees, through appropriations. Pretty much all of the bills we've supported have passed through their first House policy committees and are on their way to appropriations, including just a few to name a few of them. 1909 from Friedman, that makes cycling safer and easier by prohibiting cities from requiring bike licenses, which are often enforced along racial and income lines. It requires that motorists use a full lane to pass a cyclist instead of just 3 feet if they have a full lane. And it prohibits cities from banning e-bikes and lets cyclists go when the pedestrian signal is on. 1919 would create a free transit grant program for the youths, which is huge. If we can get people on using transit while they're young, create a habit. 1685 from Isaac Bryan would forgive up to $1,500 in parking fines for unhoused folks, which is huge because if you're unhoused, the last thing you need is having to deal with parking fines if you're under financial distress and otherwise. AB 2438, which aligns our transportation funding with greenhouse gas reduction goals, would make it really hard to do things like widen a freeway or put funding towards widening a freeway. 2147 Assemblymember Ting from last year that was vetoed by the governor would decriminalize jaywalking. We're hoping to get it through the governor this year by lobbying him pretty hard. And 2264 would standardize leading pedestrian intervals. This is one that came straight from Streets for All. We're sponsoring it, and the language came, the idea came from us. And this would, make it so that pedestrian head starts are standard on intersections, and requiring provisional licenses up to 21 years old. This bill actually found that the youngest drivers, 16 to 18, are actually far safer and get into far fewer accidents than drivers 18 to 21, because they are required to get a provisional license for 6 months where an adult has to sit with them. So this bill is a recent add to our slate, and it basically requires that 6-month advisory period to be extended until you're 21. So if you get a license, you have to have that adult in the car with you for 6 months until you get the real license. And then 1778 would prohibit freeway widening in underserved areas, like areas with a lot of pollution or poverty. If you go to the next slide, these bills are even farther. They've passed their first House Appropriations Committees, so they're on to the next House, which is cool. SB 922 is the bill that would make the CEQA exemption for bike and bus projects that made Move Culver City possible, which is SB 288. It would make that permanent. So it would allow for a lot more Move Culver Cities. So that's why we're really excited about that one. That's from Scott Wiener. And then SB 942 would create a free transit program for low-income folks. 1713 would legalize the what's called the Idaho Safety Stop, or cyclists using stop signs as yield signs, just for adults, because Newsom vetoed it last year based on the premise that it was dangerous for young folks. So we're trying again, but just for adults. AB 2863, we just endorsed this one. It's brand new, and it would add bike parking to green building standards in California, so that in order to be considered a green, fitting the green building standards, you have to have a certain amount of bike parking for both residential and non-residential. And then 2097, if you remember 1401 from last year, that's the Freeman bill that abolished parking minimums within a half mile of transit. This is basically the same bill. We're trying again, and it's passed appropriations as well. So these are even further along in the process. So good news all around. And if you want to help out on our state team, we'd love to have you. streetsforall.org/get-involved. And I'll pass it to, and get our merch too, because it's really cool and it helps support all the awesome things we're doing. I'll pass it to Michael to give us an update on Healthy Streets.
Thanks, Bubba. My favorite thing about Move Culver City is that it exists. It's really sad that a complete street is such a big deal in this part of the world, but it is, and the fact that it exists is amazing. The thing I think could use the most improvement is the ramps for the bikes. When you go above or go around the bus boarding islands, just seem a little flimsy or not quite connected, and could be a little bit wider. So it'd be great to fix that, but I love the project. So really excited to give everybody an update on our ballot measure, Healthy Streets LA. I'm going to start by playing our new video.
LA has the worst traffic in the country, and we lose $19 billion a year in lost productivity because of it. Our air is so dirty that breathing it is the equivalent of smoking up to 4 cigarettes per day. Our streets are also dangerous. A majority of Angelenos feel unsafe crossing the street, and a pedestrian is killed every 3 days. But the average trip in the city of Los Angeles is only 3 miles. There's a huge opportunity to get people out of their cars if we just gave them the infrastructure to do so. In 2015, LA City Council passed a mobility plan that's full of over 1,500 miles of improvements for pedestrians, cyclists, transit riders, and drivers. But 7 years in, we've implemented only 3% of the improvements. At that rate, it will take over 200 years to fully implement. Healthy Streets LA is a ballot measure that would mandate that the city implement its own mobility plan anytime it repaves the streets. It would both save money and dramatically speed up the implementation of safer, more multimodal streets. You deserve a city where it's safe to cross the street. or use a bike, where it's efficient to take the bus, and where roads are reserved for those that need to drive the most. Learn more at healthystreetsla.com, and let's change the city together.
So our campaign has been well underway since February, and it's a campaign, as I think most of you know, that would mandate the city of Los Angeles automatically implement its own already adopted mobility plan whenever streets are repaved. We've been getting a ton of press. You can see a few examples here, and our coalition continues to grow. We have a fantastic mix of climate, labor, business, transportation justice, et cetera, orgs. And we're now up to 37 neighborhood councils that have fully passed letters of support. That's close to 40% of all of them. I don't know of any other issue that's ever gotten 40% of neighborhood councils to agree on it. So we're really excited about that. We have now over 100 paid canvassers. We've raised close to $1 million at this point, and our plan is to submit in early June. And we're excited about that. You can learn more at our website, healthystreetsla.com. We are hiring like crazy. If you want to go collect signatures and get paid for it, you can sign up to volunteer and sign up to sign, and someone will bring a petition to you. So that's the update on Healthy Streets LA. I'm now going to pass it over to Adrian to talk about Griffith Park.
Thanks, Michael. I think that my favorite thing about Move Culver City is that the bus lanes are 24/7. As far as I'm aware, all of the bus lanes in Los Angeles are just peak hours. So it's great to see transit fully prioritized in Culver City. And I'm going to echo Bubba with the thing that I think it needs improvement is the signal timing needs to get synced in a more effective way. I am going to talk about the tragedy that happened recently in Griffith Park. There was a cyclist, Andrew Gelmert, who was killed by a drunk driver who fled the scene while he was biking on a training ride. Fortunately, they caught the person who killed him and he's being charged with murder. But it's a shame that these sorts of deaths are still happening in Los Angeles. We are advocating for some changes in Griffith Park. Parks should be prioritized for people and not cars. Nithya Raman is considering some changes to Crystal Springs Drive, hopefully a full closure to vehicles so that it could be safer and prioritized for people. We're advocating for a closure of the 5 and 134 on and off ramps in Griffith Park and having conversations with Caltrans about that. And something that we're also advocating for is getting e-shuttles throughout the park so that way we can have fewer cars in the park and people then can rely on the shuttles instead. And I'm going to toss it over to Katrina, who's going to talk about our candidate endorsements.
Thanks, Adrienne. I'd have to say my favorite part of the Move Culver City project are actually the bus bike combo lanes. I thought that they were really neat innovation when they first popped up in Culver City during the quick build version of this project. And I feel very safe riding in them. They're incredibly wide, and I think they should be adopted elsewhere. I would say the one thing I was disappointed about with the launch of Move Culver City was the loss of the outdoor dining space on Culver Boulevard. I think it drew a lot of folks to the community in a really difficult time. During the pandemic, Culver City became a real destination. And while the city's made a lot of efforts to build additional sidewalk space, it's just not the same to have cars going both ways as opposed to one way. So I'm here to talk about the candidate endorsements. You may have already seen that we made some endorsements in Council District 5 earlier this season. Additionally, we are excited to endorse in Council District 11, Erin Darling. Sorry, Michael, I don't know if I'm getting the slides advanced on my screen.
Adrian, you see them advancing? Okay, still not advancing, Katrina?
No, it might just be my fault, but I'll keep going forward.
Is it on Beverly Hills?
Not for me, but it can be.
Okay,
Additionally, we're endorsing Bob Wunderlich in Beverly Hills City Council. And we're about to just announce some new endorsements as of today. We're pleased to endorse Hilda Solis and Lindsay Horvath for the County Board of Supervisors Districts 1 and 3 respectively. And then we're also making some endorsements in state races as well. We are endorsing in the State Assembly, Laura Friedman, we endorsed previously, Mia Levis Porter, Louis Abramson, and Fatima Iqbal Zubair in their respective Assembly district races. Finally, we're pleased to endorse Lola Smallwood Cuevas in State Senate District 28. And you can find out more about these candidates and our endorsement process and the questionnaire answers that each candidate gave at our website, streetsforall.org/voter-guide. Next, I'm going to talk about one of our wins of the month. Our first win of the month is that Metro finally signed off on the final project details for the NoHo Pasadena bus rapid transit corridor. For the most part, this is 18 miles of BRT and bike infrastructure. There are a few details that are still being worked out, specifically in the city of Burbank, as well as in a couple of other project areas. But this is a campaign that we've been partnering with other nonprofit organizations and community organizations such as Eagle Rock Forward, getting the word out, driving folks to community meetings, and we're pleased to finally see it start to come to fruition. And finally, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who will talk about our last wins of the month.
Thanks, Katrina. I live the farthest from Culver City, so I've only been on it a couple times, but it's really great to see something with dedicated bus lanes and dedicated bike lanes and a proper complete street configuration. I just wish it was a little longer, as we all do. This year, we've hosted 5 council member debates, giving candidates a platform to talk about how they would solve LA's many mobility issues. I'm not going to name every single candidate, but we have CD5, CD9, CD11, CD13, and CD15. And this is almost 20 different candidates when you combine all these different debates we've done together. If you want to watch any of them, you can go to YouTube/StreetsForAll and listen to their opinions and what they want to change about mobility in Los Angeles. I'm going to pass it over to Michael to talk about next month's happy hour.
Thanks, Josh. Quick preview of June. We're excited to have the Vice Mayor of Burbank, Constantine Anthony, on, and that will be June 8th at 5 p.m. So Mayor Lee, welcome. We're very happy to have you here. Culver City Mayor Dr. Daniel Lee became the first African-American member of the Culver City City Council in its over 100-year history in 2018. A veteran of the U.S. Air Force and California Air National Guard, he currently works as project director at the James Lawson Institute. Daniel has a master's degree in social welfare from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a doctorate in social work from USC. He currently serves on the board of directors for Move to Amend, the Backbone Campaign, Mockingbird Incubator, and the Clean Power Alliance. As a city council member, Dr. Lee has championed mental health, police accountability, and very notably worked to close the Inglewood oil field. He has worked on this effort prior to his election with the Sierra Club's Clean Break Subcommittee and continued that work as an elected official. He's been a big supporter of Move Culver City and other important mobility projects in the city. As a passionate environmental advocate, Dr. Lee will work to accelerate the sorely needed transition away from fossil fuels. So I want to extend a warm welcome to Mayor Lee, and I'm going to turn it over to Olga, who's going to ask our first question.
Thanks for coming by. And yeah, I guess my favorite part of Move Culver City is that it made my commute to the Sony lot a lot safer. And I guess something to work on is I wish it connected to all of the other really good bike lanes nearby, which I know you're probably working towards. I can't wait. Awesome. So for our first question, you're famously car free and you've said you prefer to get around by foot. How does that impact your worldview, and how do you view your relationship with biking or scooters?
Well, I'll start with the last part first. Actually, I'll start with the icebreaker. I would say my least favorite part of Move Culver City is more or less what you said, that it doesn't connect to some of the other stuff. We have a path on Alinda that we hope, and I hope we continue down to where most of our schools are on Alinda. The path as it is now sort of connects to the new sort of horizontal park we have on Culver Boulevard, which will be opening soon and is actually a pretty nice path to bike down, but it needs to be connected to other things as well. So it's my hope that Move Culver City can go down Culver and connect to that at Culver and connect to Alinda, and that we extend Alinda down to the schools, and also that we connect on the other side to the Adams Boulevard bike lane, and that we have better connections to Bayona Creek and the Metro bike path on either side of the Metro station. And in the context of walking in my worldview, I think more often than not, I actually just run into people. Personally, I'm an introvert, and I'm fairly choosy about who I associate with. But if you're walking a lot, at the grocery store, from the grocery store to the pharmacy, etc., you run into people in your community a lot. And that's one of the ways that I've gotten to know Culver City and the people here. I think if you're in your car all the time, it's easy to ignore the concerns of bicyclists and pedestrians. In the context of biking, in the middle of the pandemic, Walk and Rollers, Jim Shanman's nonprofit, was actually doing a bike drive. So I actually gave my bike away about 2 years ago. I actually did have a bike for about a decade, even though I didn't ride it too often. But I gave it away because I didn't ride it too often. And for me, it's sort of a personal choice around really trying to make sure that I work on every part of my body physically. I have a couple chronic diseases which can result in muscle degeneration. So I want to do as much of that work myself with my limbs as I can. And when we're not in a pandemic context, I usually walk about 6 to 10 miles a day if I'm out and about. But I do think walking really gives you a more intimate perspective on the city itself. There are places I've walked by in Culver City and across the street in Los Angeles that I never noticed, even though they've been there for 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. I didn't notice them until I walked by them, because it's easy to just gloss over things if you're paying attention to traffic while driving. And also it's easy to, as I mentioned earlier, discard the concerns of pedestrians for safety and discard the concerns of bicyclists. I think it gives you a much better perspective and much more empathy for people who bike to work and for leisure.
6 to 8 miles a day is impressive. So my question's about the upcoming parking minimum and parking requirements reform that the Planning Commission is working on. They're going to present this, I think, this month at one of the Planning Commission meetings. And city staff has been traditionally very conservative on this issue, or just in general, as many city staffs are. And there are a lot of people in the advocacy and different advocacy organizations in Culver City that are fearful that their recommendations on parking reform will not go far enough, that they're basically going to recommend, you can, reduce parking requirements if you do X, Y, and Z, but, we're not really going to abolish all parking minimums, and we're not going to establish maximums. So if that is indeed the case, and they come out with a very conservative recommendation, how do you intend to respond to that on council and as mayor?
Well, I mean, I don't, this issue isn't exactly complicated, but I don't think people completely understand it. I think when you tell people if we get rid of parking spaces and parking minimums, we can build more housing, they understand it on the surface, but I don't think people understand how intermingled transportation policy and housing policy are. And I think to some degree, a lot of the people in our staff, I think a fairly interesting percentage, like 20% or more, live in Culver City, but most of them don't. And they're really thinking about, well, if I'm coming here, need to find a place to park, you know, in sort of an antiquated manner. There are a whole lot of people I know who are my age or below who really don't own cars, never wanted a car. They have enough money in the bank to buy a car in cash. It's not really a concern of theirs. And it's been more of a headache for a lot of people than an aid. And oftentimes, if you have to run a large errand or chore, or you know, take a road trip, you just rent a car. I think, you know, Bubba specifically, I think you've seen the way that I respond in city council meetings when staff hasn't done exactly what we told them. I think it's pretty clear that, you know, I'm unafraid about pushing us to get to where we were. And, you know, as happened when we were talking about the 100% affordable housing overlay, you know, doing my own research and bringing that to the discussion if the staff report is going to be lacking. I do believe, without making a Brown Act violation, there's some passionate support for getting rid of parking minimums and setting parking maximums on the council. There might be a need to compromise in a few places, but I think we understand that you got to do everything all at once. Like, we have to create the infrastructure that allows people to get out of their cars safely. And we got to create the culture, like in every aspect that the city has control over. And one big aspect of that is development and development requirements. You mentioned, what was it you mentioned? Bike parking as a requirement. And I just want to remind you, I don't think it's, well, it might be on the 23rd, but we're going to be considering reach codes for our buildings. And of course, I have a lot of ideas around using sustainable materials and having passive heating and cooling. But one of the other things that we could and should slip into the reach codes is a requirement for bicycle and scooter parking in all parking structures, if we have parking structures, and allowing EVs and handicap parking, that's a little bit more complicated, but just reading the chat there, but that's something that we could slip into the reach codes as well. But if staff hasn't done the research to the degree that the council has asked, I don't believe in this particular instance that it will be a problem, because there are people who passionately want to get rid of parking minimums in the city on the council at the moment.
I think I'm next. So a recall campaign against you a few months ago used images of Move Culver City to try to spur anger towards you and Councilmember Fish. Months later, the campaign was defeated handily, and the outrage of Move Culver City has died down to a large degree. Do you see Move Culver City as an asset or liability in the next election for more progressive candidates?
I see Move Culver City as an asset. In particular, we actually got a report from one of our consultants on some ballot measures that we're thinking about putting on the ballot in November. And as they do with all of their reports, they did a comprehensive survey and asked a lot of questions that they ask each time, like the direction of the city, good, bad, neutral. But one of the things that they asked, and I forget the way the question was phrased, but they asked these questions in 2019, shortly before the pandemic, in late 2020, I believe, and then in April of 2022. And one of the questions was around traffic and whether or not you think it's going in the right direction or wrong direction. And the interesting thing is, compared to the answer that they got in 2020, people surveyed in April of 2022 thought the way that the city was handling traffic was going well by about 10%. And I think that was interesting because, you know, Move Culver City opened last fall. There were, you know, a number of complaints, not a very large number, but a number of consistent complaints that we received as council members and the transportation department received. But then those leveled off. And, you know, right now it's just a trickle and people bring it up because they think it's a sticking point and a dividing line. But by and large, it has not been. It's been something that's been seen as a positive. If you're creating a downtown like Culver City really sort of stumbled into because of the pandemic, with outdoor dining and with people walking frequently, you don't want to have a whole lot of cars around. Both because people might be buzzed or slightly inebriated, but also just because it's generally unsafe to have very fast traffic around people crossing the street, going from one business to another, not one bar to another. I think Move Culver City is really us putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to focusing on mobility and actually addressing our greenhouse gas goals. So I think it's definitely a benefit to any progressive candidate running. And I hope the candidates running this year push for us to extend it and spend the type of money that we spent last year every 2 years or every 1 year, so that we can create the type of network that people will use.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. I've got the next question. You're choosing not to seek re-election in Culver City, leaving your seat open. Do you have any advice to the progressive movement on how they can maintain their majority in small cities such as Culver City and not fall backwards?
So I think the real thing is to just continue to show up. There have been some ebbs and flows, and I would say the progressive movement in general. And when I'm talking about the progressive movement, I'm talking outside of politics. There have been, the large uprising around police brutality. Prior to that, just after Trump was elected, there was a large push for sanctuary city status and sanctuary state status. And I think, it's great to have those swells, but we need consistency. So when I decided that I wasn't going to run, and I did not know what else I was going to do, I just know I didn't want to run for re-election. I actually reached out to my friend Freddie Puza to let him know, because his politics are the ones that are most aligned with mine. And my first thought, if I'm not running for re-election, how do we keep some type of consistency in terms of policy in the direction that we move the city in, which is why I reached out to him. I think it's really, well, it's up to us, which is my campaign slogan, but it's up to us to really keep things going. And it's up to sitting politicians to really build a bench and not just, present a policy and then go away, but really give support to people who will be able to keep that policy in place and keep us moving forward. Even when it comes to something like the Inglewood oil field, I feel like there's more that we could do, and there's more that we could have done. I wanted our phase out timeline to be much shorter, for instance. And I think, the way we continue to be successful is that we help bring people along and we tell them everything that we did that was dumb or made us do 3 times the amount of work that we needed to do. And we connect them to our funders and our networks to make sure that they have the type of support that they need to win.
Earlier in the pandemic, Main Street was closed to car traffic for outdoor dining and additional public space. Recently, Culver City Council voted to allow cars back onto Main Street 4 days a week, but currently the street is open to cars 24/7. What is the plan to rectify this according to what the council directed?
So, it's no secret that I was in favor of, and I would be in favor of closing down downtown Culver City to car traffic in general. There are not a majority of people in the council that believe in that. We spoke about this a little bit at our meeting on Monday, because a number of folks from Bike Culver City got on public comment to ask basically what you asked. We said that Main Street was going to be closed on Tuesdays for the farmers market, but also on the weekend. Why is that not happening? Our public works director basically said, because of supply chain issues, we're not going to have the type of hydraulic bollards that we agreed were the safest to put in place. And of course, people asked, well, we still have the farmer's market on Tuesday. How do they put that in place? And I believe he mentioned something about the vehicles there and blah, blah, blah. So I more or less suggested, and I feel like colleagues agreed, that we look into using one of two or more, however many it takes, vehicles from our transportation department that we already own, and use those as the separators to shut off Main Street on the weekends, so that we aren't waiting until January 2023 to actually shut it down. Because even though this would be on the weekends, I'm still very much afraid that a lot of the new workers coming in from Amazon Studios, Apple Studios, and otherwise will get into a pattern of thinking, I'm just going to take Main Street on the weekend. And once it's closed, there'll be a lot of angriness and consternation. So we might as well do what we said and shut it down right now. I'm hoping that we can find a way to just use Culver City vehicles to block off Main Street on the weekends, so that we can basically do what we said we're going to do sooner rather than later.
I'm up next talking about Ballona Creek. Nearly a year ago, the city council voted to open the Jackson Gate, but it's still closed. There's also an effort by a coalition that we are leading to extend the bike path further east, past Sid Cronenthal Park, through the city of Culver City into Los Angeles, all the way to Venice and Cochran, where the creek ends. So when do you expect the Jackson Gate to be finally open? Do you know what's taking so long? And what is your view on the overall project to extend the bike path eastward? Would you support that?
So I definitely support extending the bike path. I think that's a no-brainer. I think we need to connect all of the bicycle infrastructure that we have to each other, because to some degree, I think a lot of the bicycle infrastructure that has been built in LA County in the past has really just been leisure and tourist infrastructure, and the people who actually take bikes to work on a regular basis, who ride on the streets without even a drop of paint on the road to say this is a bike lane, they've lacked that infrastructure. And the more we can do to actually connect the employees going to and from work safely, I think the more equitable any talk about bicycle infrastructure becomes. I believe we can do both things in tandem, build bicycle infrastructure for leisure, for individuals, for families, but also build it so that workers can safely get to and from. When it comes to the Jackson Gate, when we took our initial vote, I think I might have been alone in this. There might have been one other colleague. I wanted us to just open the gate. Just open it, not go through this really long process of getting the special lock and opening procedure and this and that. And
be clear, is it just a padlock? Like, is that it?
It might not be that simplistic, but it's really just a lock. But what my colleagues and my colleagues agree with the suggestion of city staff to do something that's a bit more complicated and expensive. I actually thought, and I need to check with Dimitri on this, I actually thought we're going to open it up initially in April, but I think now it's scheduled for either late May or June. A lot of the delays and some of the city infrastructure projects that we talk about generally, the excuse that we usually get is supply chain issues. As I said, I didn't think it was that much of a big deal to just open the gate. Like the gate is open in various places in Culver City and other parts of West LA. But my colleagues thought different. There is a little bit of tiptoeing because a number of people who live on Jackson do not want the gate open. And I think going with this more complicated version of the gate is an attempt to try to allay some of their fears. But there are people, in various places in the Arts District who've lived on streets where they've had a gate open to Ballona Creek the entire time that they've lived there. And I think, these neighbors can give testimony to the other neighbors about the relative safety of it. I mean, additionally, of course, there are openings to the creek right there on Overland Boulevard. And then, of course, if you go past our high school, there's a bridge over the creek and various entrances. It's a little bit more of an overblown fear than I can relate to, but I'm hoping it'll be opening in the next month.
You have the rare experience of having been a city council candidate, a state senate candidate, and now U.S. congressional candidate. What are the biggest barriers facing progressive candidates like yourself? How can we help change the way we hold elections so we elect more people like you? Any advice to those that want to run for office?
So I think when it comes to the city council level, especially in LA City has a great model. I mean, if you are raising money from people within the city, you get a 6 times match as long as you get up to a certain level of funding. I think the biggest thing holding most progressive candidates back is money. It's always money. It seems like it always will be money. But if we invest in systems like they have in LA City, it will give smaller candidates or more working class candidates or just progressive candidates who come from community orgs or nonprofits a chance to compete with more well-money candidates and career politicians. When it comes to the state and federal level, I think the biggest advice that I would give in terms of running the campaign is just remember what you learned on the local level. A lot of things are incredibly similar. Instead of having to report to the FPPC, you have to report to the FEC. But most things aren't substantively different. You still have to have mail. You still have to find a way to contact people, i.e. phone banking, text banking. You still have to have logos and yard signs. It's not really a substantive difference. It's more like scaling. If you know how to do things on the small scale, you just need to be able to raise enough money to actually do those things on a larger scale. And more so on the state senate and congressional level, of course, there's a lot of fixing that happens with the Democratic Party. So I think it's incredibly important to have a strategy that assumes that you might not get certain endorsements, but the real important thing is just to talk to as many people as possible on the phone, at their door, via social media, via political ads. But most things are similar. Just really focus on that fundraising and ask everyone you know. There are a number of people that I didn't ask initially who are like, why haven't you asked me for money? And then there are other people who are like, you only asked me for money twice, I can donate again. Even people who you think might not be able to afford it, if they believe in you, they'll find a way, or they'll introduce you to their friends. And it's really important to ask everybody and to really communicate to them sincerely why you're running, because their pocketbooks respond if their principles and their policies align.
Culver City went from a sundown town to having a historic progressive supermajority, and now is still a progressive majority. Residents and neighbors are living in a tiny progressive blip in the entire history of Culver City. How can advocates like us better support the progressives we elect while we still have you in office?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just showing up. There are a lot of people who, for a while, had been saying, you're changing our city. And for a while there, I disagreed. But recently I've looked at, the things that we have been able to do in 4 years, turn around and take a different track on the Inglewood oil field, vote to close it down, pass rent control pass reparations, pass a property transfer tax. We took our first steps towards an affordable housing overlay. We took our first steps towards raising the minimum wage. I'm hoping to have a conversation around participatory budgeting this summer. And, you know, from the beginning to the end of the pandemic, parts of our city look completely different. And of course, Move Culver City is a big part of that. I think the real way to support is just to be there. One of the quotes that I've been saying for the last decade that I still believe is true, but is the opposite of what most Americans think, is that democracy is what happens between elections and not the elections themselves. I think most people think, yes, I voted, I participated in democracy. As hard as it is for people to vote in certain parts of the country, and I am from the South, that's the easy part. The hard part is coming to the meetings when you're tired from work and you would rather go to sleep. You know, the hard part is showing up at those special town halls on a specific subject, which might typically be dominated by people who don't even want to talk about the subject at all. Part of it is really showing the people who are strong progressives who have been elected that you're willing to put more of your time into this effort too. And one of the things that I think is a great thing that I hope is permanent in Culver City, I know we've already said it was on the council level, but things sometimes seem to fall back, is to have our hybrid meetings. So, you know, people can get on public comment virtually, or they can come in person. This helps out a lot of people because a lot of people who come to our meetings on a frequent basis live within a certain easily walkable radius of downtown. People in Fox Hills, less often. People in West Culver, less often. If we have hybrid meetings forever going forward, you know, we expand access, which expands democracy and expands the number of people and the types of voices that we hear from. If you've been to any city council meeting in any city, including LA City, you know it's the usual suspects who show up on one side or the other, or on no side, and you're not really hearing from the community. And that happens on a lot of issues. A lot of issues. The vast majority of people who show up are people who are in favor of whatever item it is. And, you know, that's fine when it's an item that I agree with, but that's not democracy. We should be able to hear from the entire community on a regular basis, and hybrid meetings help that. And what helps progressive politicians, especially morale, is just people showing up and showing up for the policies that they were glad to see on our website and our campaign material when we actually get to the point where we can actually pull the switch and put some of those policies in place.
One final question before we go to public questions. You've been instrumental in working towards closing the Inglewood oil field. What obstacles are still in the way to close the oil field? And how do we phase out oil drilling in all of Southern California?
So our biggest obstacle right now, I can't really talk about, but of course we voted to close down the oil field, and it was encouraging to see LA County follow, and then LA City a few months later, though things are still vague and yet to be worked out. Our biggest problem right now is we're being sued by the oil operator. I can't get into the specifics because we're trying to engage in talks to avoid a lawsuit. But that's the biggest potential problem at the moment. Our city attorney's office has traditionally been fairly conservative, but prior to the lawsuit being filed, they thought we were on pretty firm legal ground with our phase out and our steps taken to phase out the Inglewood oil field. So that the lawsuit's the biggest thing right now. Once we either come to an agreement or decide that we can't come to an agreement, then we'll work towards putting the put in the requirements that we passed when we voted to close down the Inglewood oil field in place. And in Southern California more generally, it's an easy question if it's, you know, in the middle part of the county where most of the oil extraction infrastructure has been taken out. It's a harder question in places like Long Beach and San Pedro and other areas where, and even Torrance, where they're still refining a lot of crude or drilling for a lot of oil, and there a lot of the economy of those areas is much more tied to oil. I think what we need are state and federal subsidies to allow municipalities or counties where applicable to say that we do want to phase out oil drilling. And this is the money that we have to create other strong, clean energy union jobs so that the people who work in those industries in their areas aren't tossed out on the street or aren't forced to work a non-union job for a third of the price.
Mayor, I think we have time for 2 last questions from the audience. The first question is, are there any plans to activate the space that has been used for curb extensions as part of Move Culver City? For example, by introducing street vending near the intersection of Washington and Culver.
We haven't really talked about that on the curb extensions. I think that might be something worth exploring where we have other curb extensions like near La Biona Elementary, where there is an ice cream man and people selling various wares from time to time, but that's not something that we've deeply explored. We had put some substantive conversations around street vending on hold because the legislation that was passed at the state level was an attempt to make street vending easier and legal, but it ended up basically requiring a lot of vendors who don't have a lot of money to start to get very, very expensive licenses. And we were trying to work out a way to encourage it in a safe manner, but we haven't really looked at the curbs as much yet. Yeah.
My own follow-up, but I'm curious, my understanding of Move Culver City is it's a relatively quick build implementation. Is there a plan to make it permanent and use different materials?
Yes, I mean, that's up to us. The entire project, the pilot is 12 months. So at the end of the 12-month period, there will be more in-depth evaluation. 2 things, I think there are certain parts of Move Culver City that would be converted into permanent material. But because it was so cost effective, I think there is a thought that some of the material used will stay in place as is, partially because it's so inexpensive. And if it, for some reason, is injured or if there's a car accident or whatever, it's also very inexpensive to replace.
Last question from the audience. You voted to open up Main Street to cars. This seems contrary to the goals you've stated for downtown Culver City. Are there any plans to extend Move Culver City to cover Main Street to keep that arterial safe for bikes? And maybe you can just expanding on that a little bit, talk about where you see this going. What other streets in Culver City do you see being changed? And you talked about building a network. Would that just be everywhere?
So first, as I feel like I started, I would love to see all of downtown Culver City blocked off to car traffic. And I can check the tape, but I don't believe that I voted to open up Main Street, Culver City. The council did. I'm pretty sure I was a nay. But in the context of how that associates with Move Culver City, the extensions that I would want to see as priorities is connecting Move Culver City to the Adams bike path first. I think we could have a very long continuous path there if we just do something in that sort of interim space. Also, The other priority for me would be connecting Culver and our new horizontal park. Our stormwater project is over, so the park that's on top of our stormwater remediation is open. That would, give us a few more miles of bike path. Also, and this, really requires a whole lot of collaboration with the LA City. But, it would be great to connect Move Culver City to protected bike lanes, which I know do not exist yet on Overland and Motor. In particular, those are fairly well-trafficked streets. Ideally, it would be great to have a bike lane on Sepulveda. I feel like there are a lot of people who, if they had more guaranteed safety, would bike to and from UCLA for school or work. And we have a lot of UCLA students and a lot of UCLA faculty and staff who live in Culver City. But those would be the start. The connections to Bayona Creek would also be important, but also just better connections to the LA Metro bike path and working with LA Metro as well on providing better lighting for safety, both on the LA Metro bike path, but also on Bayona Creek. I think a lot of people utilize those pieces of bicycle infrastructure during the day, but avoid them during the night out of concerns for safety. And I feel like if we added more light to start, that would be a step in the right direction, and we could get more people on those bike paths all hours of the day and night.
Great. I also think Culver City, you could do a lot of traffic calming on residential streets as well, kind of like West Hollywood has done, little mini traffic circles, curb extensions, chicanes, things like that. I think it would be right for it. All right, well, I think we are pretty much at time. Just want to remind everybody next month, June 8th, Wednesday, June 8th, 5 to 6 p.m. We'll have the Vice Mayor Burbank, Constantine Anthony. Mayor Lee, thank you so much for your time and for being here. Good luck with your campaign. And we'll talk to everybody soon. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you all for having me. Have a great night.
Good night.